Ed, we ready? Mr. Johnson, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, let's give it a shot, man. Let's give it a shot. You're tuned into WBH Radio. I'm your host, William Holly. Thank you for joining me. Here on the podcast today is a historian, a writer, a researcher. He is the executive director of the Black Fives Foundation, the one and only Claude Johnson. Mr. Johnson, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Your appearance is special because you took the drive in. Like, for those who can't see, he's actually in studio with me, and your journey started where today?
Greenwich, Connecticut.
Greenwich, Connecticut. He made the drive in. It makes me believe that, maybe we're doing some quality work here,
Yeah, but it's like no thing, and it's also for the culture. Yeah. It's for you. I really appreciate your show. I've been watching some of the episodes, listening to your interview with Skip Bayless on the way down here. This is legit. Like, it's humble, but you got to start humble. Yes. But it doesn't look humble when you're on TV. You know what I'm saying? It looks like you got all the equipment here. You got everything. I envy your setup.
I'm trying. Thank you so much. I'm trying. Claude, let's lay out a few things before we really dive into it. Lay out some information. In February 2022, you will be releasing a book. It's called The Black Fives, The Epic Story of Basketball's Forgotten Era. Correct?
Yes,
Did I have that correct?
That's right.
The Black Fives refers to a period in basketball that predates the NBA's integration, when basically there were all black teams. Black folks doing what they have to do when doors were closed. They had their own league. That correct?
Yeah.
You are the executive director of the Black Fives Foundation, what I mentioned. And the mission statement reads, to research, preserve, showcase, teach, and honor the pre-NBA history of African Americans in basketball. Claude, please tell me, when were you first introduced to this period in time, this epoch, and not only black history, but American history?
Well, years ago, I was working at the NBA.
Okay.
And I was in what was called, and still called, NBA Properties. And I was the director of international licensing, which was the consumer products division at the time. This was when Rick Welch was working there, and a bunch of other people that have gone on to amazing careers. Mm-hmm. And they were celebrating their 50th anniversary, which was in 1996. Mm-hmm. But it's really not the 50th anniversary because the league was formed in 1949, but nevertheless, they celebrated it in 1996. Mm-hmm. And I was there, and they published this book called the NBA Encyclopedia of Basketball. And it was an 800-page book, but only 3 of those pages were devoted to early African-American basketball teams that played before.
Right.
But I had read Arthur Ashe's book, A Hard Road to Glory, mm-hmm. which has a chapter on basketball. It's like the 400-year journey of African-American athletes. Mm-hmm. And in that section on basketball, he was talking about several teams like the Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn.
Okay.
An all-black social and athletic club that had been formed in 1904. And I was like, wait, I live in Brooklyn. I'm smart. I'm athletic. I know about licensing. That has to be on a T-shirt one day. Right. And so, I started looking into it, but nobody knew anything about these earlier teams. And those two teams, those 3 pages were devoted to just 2 teams, the New York Renaissance, mm-hmm. which is the most famous, and then also the Harlem Globetrotters, which is equally famous. Mm-hmm. But I thought, well, how come they don't have more on this? And everywhere I looked, there was just nobody knew. Right. The Hall of Fame didn't know. The onboard historian at the league didn't know. Mm-hmm. The National Archives, like, nobody had this information. So I ended up just having to go to the Schomburg and sit in the basement and look at microfilm and do this on weekends and holidays. And
the Schomburg is a library here in Harlem, New York City.
Yeah, the Schomburg Library, which is part of the New York Public Library System.
And when you dove into this history, like, what did you experience? How did it feel?
I mean, I at first, so this was back before things were digitized.
Right.
So I first had to even learn how do you research?
Right.
Like, what is research? Because in the book, in Arthur Ashe's book, which was by Amistad Press, which is now owned by within HarperCollins, they had, a little note that said, thank you to these people, different people who researched in the book. So I tried to contact those people, but this was almost at the beginning of, the NBA had just launched NBA.com. This was how far back this was, right? So it was all new. And so you couldn't just up and find somebody like that. So eventually I learned that you have to just go to the library.
Yeah.
And the secret was in the microfilm. And so in the microfilm, you got to go to the Schomburg Library in the basement. They have all the microfilm readers. They don't do that. They have it still, but less and less because now it's all digitized. So you go to the library and you look up the microfilm on their catalog, and then you go, okay, New York Age, which was one of the African American newspapers of that time. Let me have 1900 to 1903.
You just going through the articles.
Yeah, and then you load up you get the reel, and you load it up into the machine, and then you go through the reel, and it just goes like one page at a time. New York Age, January 1st, 1900, page 1. And you look through, and it's like page 2. And after a while, you realize, okay, it's always on page 6, and it's every week.
Right.
So now you get to, okay, now I don't have to worry about all this other stuff. I like to go right to page 6. And then keep going like that for like all the newspapers, all the years, and this pattern developed.
So, Claude, you really put the legwork in. You went and, going back to like a DJ term, you were digging in the crates.
For real.
Looking for this information. What are some of the details from this period that piqued your interest, that really grabbed your attention?
Yeah, just the fact that every week, after about 1904, they started reporting on games, and African-American basketball teams. And slowly this pattern started to emerge that there was this culture of basketball that had formed, starting 1904, 1906, Brooklyn, New York City. Back then, the black community was centered around Midtown.
Right.
So really, even before Harlem, there was basketball in New York City, but it was like around, the St. Christopher Club, which was sponsored by the St. Philip's Church on West 26th Street, and then when everybody moved up to Harlem, so then it was Harlem, it was Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Chicago, slowly these teams were emerging, Philly, and I started to just write everything down, because to my mind, I was like, okay, this is fascinating.
Yes.
And it was also, how come nobody knows about this? Like, I'm saying, how come nobody, like, it was almost like so easy to find.
Right.
Because I'm sitting there, I'm going, wait, this can't be for real. Is this for real? Right. And I'm like looking, and I keep finding more and more. And I'm like, okay. And back then you couldn't, I had to bring like a bag full of dimes because you had to make a copy, by going over to the machine and make a, like put a dime in the microfilm reader. So it was like totally gritty, but I didn't care because it was just so fascinating to me.
It's a new discovery.
Yeah, I felt like I was discovering like King Tut or something. Seriously.
The Black Fives, right? The NBA is not created or it's not integrated, and these black folks put together their own teams. What do we know about the players? Like, who were these guys? They high schoolers? They were plumbers? Like, what was it like?
Well, so at the very beginning, it was strictly amateur reasons that these teams formed. So it was through churches, black social clubs, athletic clubs, students, because sometimes there was a school involved that had their own team. Back then, most school districts were segregated, racially segregated. So, but a lot of these guys were, and women too, they had either another job could be a messenger, could be a stenographer, could be a bank clerk. Some of them had degrees, but those degrees didn't really help them so much in the early days. You could have a degree but still be a mail clerk.
Right.
But that was a respected position.
Right.
My grandfather was a Pullman porter.
Okay.
And
On a train.
On a train, yeah.
Like Malcolm X used to do, right?
Yeah, like he never learned how to read or write, but he raised a family that way, So, and that was in Chicago on the South Side. So, I had a great deal of respect and appreciation for this history, just through my grandparents and their brothers and sisters, because they all came from Louisiana.
Right.
And I felt like, and a lot of these players, especially in inner city, they had roots in the South typically, or they were, they were recent immigrants from the West Indies, Jamaica, St. Kitts, Panama, different, islands, Barbados.
Right.
What used to be the Danish West Indies is now the U.S. Virgin Islands, but Denmark used to own that. So I just started to appreciate the actual individuals too.
Yes.
And so, leaders start to emerge. So first there's the newspaper men who are actually covering this history. Mm-hmm. And then there's the music aspect of it, the cultural part. So all these early games would have advertisements that said basketball and dance.
Mm-hmm. It was a show, Claude.
Yeah, it was like a show. But it wasn't just a show. It was more than a show. It was a meaningful social event, okay. Right? Because you would have somebody from North Carolina that would come up, mm-hmm. and other people from North Carolina, they didn't know each other. The only way, let me turn this off. Mm-hmm. The only way they would get to know each other would be to go to an event like a rent party or whatever, right. Or a dance and basketball in New York City. And this is how like social networking got started, sure. Like that was the early days of it. And there was the music was important because in the early days, the only way you could really listen to music was if you had sheet music and a player piano or a piano in your parlor. But a lot of people couldn't really afford that. Mm-hmm. So around 1910, the phonograph and the radio started to become commercially available. Right. And because of that, black music started to become popular. Like people didn't even actually know it was black music. They just saw the sheet music you could buy. Right. But now when they started hearing it, it was like, okay, wait, we have to go listen to this. But you couldn't bring that orchestra into your living room. Right. You had to go see that live.
With these events, it'll be basketball, and then maybe afterwards there'll be a dance party?
Yeah, so because people want to hear this music live, yeah. And dancing was already popular anyway, mostly to waltzes. Mm-hmm. Now you have ragtime, you have blues, you have jazz, and you have people that want to hear it. Mm-hmm. And you have these empty ballrooms on certain nights. Mm-hmm. So this was an opportunity for those bands to play in front of people, as well as for those enterprising black basketball promoters to say, hey, let's have a game too. Right. So now you have this combination of interests mm-hmm. that are renting out the Manhattan Casino in Harlem, for example, seats 6,000 people. And now you have a game. Before that, you have music. During halftime, you have music. Afterwards, you have dancing till past midnight. Mm-hmm. And so it became, this way that people got together. You didn't really know what was going on back home until or in another city until you start talking to people in this format.
Right. You mentioned the promoters. When I was looking at the Black Fives, I would liken it to the Negro Leagues, Jackie Robinson, yes. Satchel Paige, and Josh Gibson, the Negro baseball leagues. Was there black commerce associated with the Black Fives that they have? Because I know in the Negro Leagues, it was black media, it was black folks selling the popcorn, it was black owners, it was black managers. Like, what about the business of the Black Five?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So at the beginning, it was, let's use an example. It was the St. Christopher Club was a team that was formed underneath the umbrella of St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, an all-black church, one of the most wealthy and exclusive and strong congregations in the country. But they formed this organization to protect youth on the street from just distraction and moral decay is what they called it. So they formed this athletic club called the St. Christopher Club. Now they want to raise money because they're trying to bring in more people. It started off as a Bible study, fellowship. And so they have these games. Now they charge money at the game, 35 cents, 25 cents, and that helps pay for the music because they have a house band. Helps pay for the rental of the space because nobody really had gyms back then. Mm-hmm. You had to rent a ballroom or an armory. And so now you have 100 people. Then you have like 300 people. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly a couple years later, 1,000 people per game. Now all of a sudden 3,000 per game. Now people are like, yo, wait, where's the money? Yeah. Right? And so this is when players started saying, hey, we want to cut too. Yeah. And so then it became more of, okay, semi-pro, like we'll share the gate receipts with everybody, with the players and so on. And this way we can attract better players, better talent. Mm-hmm. And then that eventually led to, well, we just, we can play for 4 or 5 teams in a week if we want, because there's no contract. And along comes Bob Douglas, who was an African-American basketball pioneer from St. Kitts. Okay. And he's been watching what's been going on, and he says, well, why don't we just offer full-time contracts, full-year contracts to our players? Wow. And so he basically consolidates all the best players, and he goes to the Renaissance Ballroom, which was a new facility that had just been opened up at the corner of West 138th and 7th at the time. And he says, well, if you let us play here, we'll change our name to the New York Renaissance, because back then his team was called the Spartan Athletic Club. Okay. They did cricket, they did track and field, they did tennis, they did basketball. And the owner, who was also West Indian, said, yeah, well, that's a good idea. And so that's how they became the New York Renaissance, right? And so after that, now you have basketball, you have events there, you have community festivities, recognition, and all the commerce that goes with it, because the Renaissance Ballroom was built, financed, owned, operated by black folks. Mm-hmm. Some from the West Indies, some from the South, some from generically, up north through generations, right? So now you have storefronts, you have, a barbershop, you have a pharmacy, you have a liquor store, you have different things going on. Right.
Black communities.
In the black community, yeah. And so, even the advertising was money that went to that black newspaper. Yes. The Amsterdam News, or the New York Age. And then you started having teams that would come from D.C. or from Philly to play in New York, mm-hmm. or from other places. And New York became the hub of black basketball. So you remember how up on West 135th, if you go up there, like right next to the YMCA up there. Yes. It said Harlem plays the best ball in the country. Right. You know that sign?
Yes.
Okay, but that wasn't because of Harlem. That was because of way back before that, before Harlem.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I thought that was for the Rucker.
Yeah, well, ironically, the Rucker is across the street from the Manhattan Casino that I just named, which is where all these black teams used to come play. It was so popular, 6,000 people back then. That's a lot, right? They had a hotel, they had a bar, they had other events and venues and things that they did there. They had an outdoor beer garden, they had indoor outdoor facility, and what would happen is 2 black teams that weren't even from New York City would go to New York City to play, right? because it was the venue, it was the place to be. And that's how New York City became the mecca of black basketball.
Going through the website, you just mentioned the New York Renaissance. One of the more popular AAU teams in New York City right now is called the New York Rens. And going through your website, I learned that they got that name from the New York Renaissance, one of the teams during the Black Five era.
I want to point out, since you're naming that organization, their real name is the New Renaissance Basketball Association. And they're using that name with our permission because back when I was at the league, and then shortly after that, when I learned about licensing, I realized nobody owns this mark. Mm-hmm. And so, we, my organization, spent a lot of effort trademarking all the names of all these teams.
Wow.
From the Black Fives era.
How many teams?
Dozens. And so the reason why I did that at first was because of the commercial idea of having T-shirts and jerseys and the throwbacks, because this was back when Mitchell and Ness was the $300 throwback.
Right.
And we did our own line back then. It was Black Fives Incorporated. But after a while, I realized that it's really hard to sell you or your nephew a T-shirt. Mm-hmm. It's better to talk to you about a cause, and that cause will be Black history education reform, right, through the history of black basketball. And so in 2013, I basically took the Black Fives Inc. and all its assets, which was the trademarks and the artifacts that we have, and donated them all to this new foundation, this 501c3 that I had created. Mm-hmm. And so from that, there's several teams that, wished to use the name New York Rens to shout out and to promote this history for their own selves and also for the sake of the legacy. Right. And one of them was New Renaissance Basketball Association. So whenever you see that, it's a shout out to their organization, which is a valid, reputable organization, but it's also a shout out to us. And, we're appreciative of that relationship with them.
Beautiful. Are there any individuals that we may know today, like from that era? Are there any guys or any names that we may know or is in the Basketball Hall of Fame or went on into the NBA?
Yes. Well, I want to say yes and no, because a lot of those players are no longer with us. Mm-hmm. I became friends with a man named John Isaacs, who was one of the last living players from the 1939 New York Rens team that won the inaugural World Championship of Professional Basketball, which was actually played in Chicago in 1939. This was a pool of the 12 best pro teams that were invited by the Chicago Herald-American, which was a newspaper back then. Mm-hmm. I also got a chance to meet Pop Gates. He's in the Hall of Fame. John Isaacs was on that team. He was their point guard, fiery. He did all the things that they didn't keep stats on back then. Right. Rebounds, steals, assists, forced turnovers, blocked shots. You just didn't have that back then. But everybody he played with ended up in the Hall of Fame. Okay. So we lobbied, and eventually, he was posthumously enshrined in the Hall of Fame. Another person who played during this era was Chuck Cooper, briefly for the Harlem Globetrotters, and he was the first African American drafted in the NBA by the Boston Celtics. Yes. And then also Nat Clifton, Sweetwater Clifton, who was the first man to sign a contract, first black man to sign a contract with the league. He ended up playing with the Knicks, and he played with the Renaissance and also briefly with the Harlem Globetrotters. And then you have everybody else, unfortunately, that was, when the Black Fives era ended, and the NBA took off, and the Globetrotters took off in a different direction, there was really nothing left for them you know, a lot of the guys ended up opting to play with the Globetrotters. There was a man named Hank Dizzoni who played with the Wrens, who also he was the fourth player that was signed in the NBA by the St. Louis Hawks. But people don't know about him because he quit the NBA because of racism after 5 games.
Wow.
That's how hard it was for him. He said, I can make more money and I'm happier back in Harlem running my store, you know, so.
I mean, I guess you come from all black league and communities, you around your own people, to now have to go out in the NBA and endure that, going on the road with your teammates. You can't eat in certain restaurants. I can see why you opted to walk away. Y'all can have this.
And I mean, you know, years later, there was that same scenario with some of the Rutgers stars, right? So Joe Hammond and Pee Wee Kirkland and others, you know, who were like, yo, I could play in the NBA, but I could make more money out here, you know, doing what I'm doing now. So it was a different format, different context. But, you know, they were the greats of their time.
Excellent. Claude, I was reading that the Oklahoma City Thunder reached out to you a few years ago and invited you to come teach this history to their players. What was that like? Did they fly you first class?
I can't remember, but they flew me out there. They put me up first class, that's for sure. And I had a first class dinner and you know, encounters with Sam Presti, who's their, you know,
Their GM, the guy who drafted KD, Russ, Harden.
Oh my God! I mean, what's crazy? I mean, to have 6 first-round draft, the dude is ridiculously talented at what he does. A brilliant thinker, but he's just as much of a brilliant man in terms of wisdom and teaching. You know, just be still, like just stop for a second, like do all this. But also, you know, treat our players, right? Like they're humans first.
Yes.
They're people first. And so when you go through that facility, you see that in all the things that they do. I mean, they have, you know, an onboard, you know, psychiatrist, psychologist. They have, you know, first-rate food and dietitian and just on with the facility and everything that they do. So Sam reached out to me because he saw something I forget where it was, but he saw something online or a video, and he said, "What's going on? Why do not more people know about this?" And he reached out through his assistant and said, "You got to come here, and we got to do something. I don't know what yet." So you know, I flew out and we talked, and you know, it was beautiful because it was he and I at his table, you know, at the restaurant, you know, like basically the #1 restaurant in town. And so we came up with this idea of, you know, how do we reach back into the vault of black basketball in Oklahoma? Now, people don't really realize or think about, well, Oklahoma has a black basketball history, but with a little bit of research, because I love to do the research,
there you go.
I found out very quickly that in the land rush, there were African Americans in the Oklahoma land rush. And they they incorporated 50 towns in Oklahoma during that time. And of those 50 towns, many of them ended up with black high schools that had their own teams, and then they had, you know, a Negro interscholastic basketball championship at the end of the school year. And some of those teams still exist, right? So you have Frederick Douglass versus Booker T. Washington, Tulsa versus Oklahoma City. That's still a rivalry today. And so, and they had some other teams out there, you know, the Oklahoma Ramblers and, you know, some clubs like that. Right. So we started talking about that. And so that was part of my presentation. And the other part of my presentation was just showing, you know, here's a ball with laces. It doesn't have a needle hole. How did they do that? And here's a pair of, you know, vintage shoes that this was before you had rubber. So you had a leather sole, canvas and leather, hand cobbled craftsmanship in a state-of-the-art basketball shoe from 1905.
Wow.
And so I was showing them some of that show and tell, and everybody. And what they did was they made it a mandatory post-practice meeting for all players.
Wow. So you had everybody's attention, Claude.
Yeah,
I was looking at that roster. That was
dope.
2019. You had Russell Westbrook, Paul
Yes.
George. Like, what was their
Yes.
reaction?
I mean, they were just. First of all, you had they were very interested, but then also afterwards, they thanked me, and we just had like that nice connection. And then they were asking questions too.
Right.
I want to say Russ especially was like, "Yo, where can I get those shoes?" Because they're dope looking shoes. They just recently we loaned them to the Museum of the City of New York because they had an exhibition on the history of basketball in New York City, and they asked us to loan them some items for that. So it was eye-opening. And it was also, for me, a thrill because we've been trying to get the NBA's attention on this for a long time. And the Oklahoma City Thunder were the first organization to say, we'll talk to our players. Because usually, when we've done something in the past, typically we're not connecting with the players.
Yeah.
And so, but yet our first grant as a nonprofit, remember I was mentioning how we've switched to a nonprofit. So our first grant was with the NBA Players Union Foundation.
Wow.
So, people don't realize that, it's one league in a way, but within that, there's the players,
Yes, sir.
which is labor, and there's the league, the owners, which is management.
Yes.
And so it's kind of, and then there's the franchises themselves. And within each franchise, they have some leeway to do whatever they wish. So Sam was very generous and very open and inviting. And then the other thing I found out, which is just the magic of life sometimes, is he and I went to the same high school.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where's that?
It's called Concord Carlisle High School in Concord, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Like, not at the same time,
Right.
but... I was just trying to check him out, like, who is this
Yeah.
dude? Like, yes, we know that part, but what's he about? And so it turns out that in Boston, even when I was going to high school there, they have this program called the METCO program, METCO. And it has to do with busing essentially inner city kids, which is typically black kids, out to the suburbs like Concord,
Okay.
to go to those schools as a cultural exchange, an immersion program. It's voluntary. You have to sign up and you have to be eligible, but a lot of these players also played sports. A lot of these students also played sports. So when a Metco kid from inner city Boston would play sports out in Concord, they had to get on a bus at 5 a.m. and get to, just to get to practice or get home at 8 or 9 p.m. And so what Sam did is he said, okay, I'm just going to have some of these players stay at my house.
Wow.
Right. And then later he
as a youngster, high school.
Yeah. Because he just realized, like, what are y'all doing? Like, why it shouldn't be this hard, right? And if you knew about Metco, and your listeners, if you're listening and you understand Metco, like, you'll realize, I get that, because they go to all the towns, and they're often, excellent athletes as well. So then he put that into a scholarship years later for Metco program students. So I was like, okay, very few people even know about the Metco program. Yeah. Sam is intrinsically involved in that, and he's being very generous. And that just told you already the kind of person he is. The kind of person he is, indeed.
That experience, lecturing to the Oklahoma City Thunder, one of the NBA's franchises, Russell Westbrook's in the room. He's a league MVP. How special was that moment for you? Because as I sit here and I hear your story, you talk about being in the Schomburg Library in the basement with dimes, trying to get the microfilm, trying to get the history back in the 90s. To have that cultivate into now the NBA is recognizing this period in basketball that you always wanted them to see. Like, what was that moment like for you?
Yeah, I mean, literally dropping dimes, right?
Yeah.
Back in the day, right? I mean, seriously,
Yes, sir.
you know. I mean, Steven Adams was there. Dennis Schroeder was there.
Hami Diallo, the New York native.
That's right. He was, I think, a rookie at the time. And Mo Cheeks, assistant coach.
Yep.
Who, by the way, has his birthday today. So shout out to him. And the point is that I think for me, you know, at the time, I just went with it. Like, you just got to go with that flow. And I was just being a professional. I was just teaching. I like talking about this history. I like teaching. And then I also like the storytelling of, okay, well, what exactly can we take away from this, right? So one thing to take away was that in the earliest days, there was this fight between the faction that wanted to keep basketball strictly amateur and those that said, okay, but there's all this money and look at what the white teams are doing. We should just be professionals. And there was a real struggle. And this was also during the time when the AAU was imposing penalties and sanctions. And you had to decide, do I want to be professional or do I want to be amateur? And within the black community, there was this struggle because at the time you had, again, like, do we try to copy white society for approval, right? So wear what they wear, you know, all you know, the derby and the thing and the this and the suit and the high collar, or do we just be like, nah, we have our own identity, we're doing our own thing? And that was how the Harlem Renaissance period of cultural flourishing came about in the first place. It was finally after World War I, people were like, why are we doing that? Like, we're coming back from fighting for this country in World War I, and some of us are getting lynched in uniform. Indeed. In uniform.
Indeed.
So what? And then you had the summer of 1919. You had Tulsa. You had the East St. Louis massacre. You had all these things going on. So black folks were like, enough of that. Like, we just want to be who we are. And so through that same thing happened in basketball. And so it all came together with the New York Renaissance. And so I felt like, you know, when you talk about this history and you talk about like where it came from and the fight of that, I always try to bring that up. And sure enough, in that room, you know, it's like, interesting. So you mean there was even a fight just to be a professional?
Yep.
You know, and so as a professional baller, you know, you're sitting there, a lot of the guys were like, wow, that's that's interesting. So a couple of questions, you know, and so all you want is the interaction from that. And Sam wasn't even in the room. Like, it was just the coaches, Billy Donovan, assistants, and maybe like one or two video guys. And we made some boards, and it was really cool. And for me personally, I just felt like, you know, this is the start of something.
Yes.
Because if they can do it, and if Sam is not if, but he's respected, then maybe that can lead to some other things that, you know, along those lines. I'm always very humble about it and grateful. So I'm not expecting anything, but you know, we definitely have stayed in contact. And what I want to do next is, there's no way for me to clone myself, but what I'd like to do next is I'd like to ideally have a relationship with the league where every year we have something like a Black Fives Academy where each team sends a representative or two representatives, and then I get to train those trainers. I get to train them so that they can go back to their team and their community relations and do that presentation that I would have done themselves. And really be confident about it, skilled at it, talk to their own players, so that this way, you know, we can start expanding and bringing scale to, you know, to our efforts with the mission and, you know, what we're doing at the foundation.
Claude, you're teaching the history, You've done the research. I want to ask, why is it important that we know this history?
Well, first, we have a slogan that I devised, years ago, and it's "Make History Now," and it's a trademarked slogan, and it came about because I was looking at, Eckhart Tolle, who's a philosopher, who talks about the power of now, and then everybody wants to make history, but you can't make history someday. You can only make history now by choices you make right now. And so I took that and put the double meaning into it, which is also make that history from back then relevant today. Right? So make that history now, like make that relevant. And so my whole thing was always, it was a struggle for a long time, like to answer that question, well, why? But then you realize, wait a minute, what happened? And that history always repeats itself, and that we can learn from the past. We don't want to dwell in the past. We're not trying to sit there and go, oh, this was great. We're trying to say, okay, here's this amazing history. These players and pioneers overcame obstacles, went around, navigated, figured it out, transcended what was going on. But also, you can make history out of history.
Yes.
So last year, during the summer after the murder of George Floyd, I started to realize, and it was something brewing inside already anyway, but I started to realize, why are we saying, hey, look at these pioneers, they were amazing, they overcame these obstacles, aren't they great? Give them a round of applause. Right. Yeah, like that wasn't enough, because celebrating Black history is no longer enough. And I always would think of it as applied history. Like, what are we doing with this history?
There you go. I like that.
Right?
Applied history. I like
applied
that.
history. I looked it up. Like, nobody's teaching applied history, but it should be a course.
Yes.
And so then I started to say, well, wait a minute. Why was there even a Black Fives era of racially segregated basketball? Why is there even a Black Fives Foundation? Let's talk about that, and let's get into that conversation. Let's use sports because it's ubiquitous, and let's figure out how can we use these amazing historical stories to start conversations which may be uncomfortable for some people, but it's reality. And so, we can't get there easily, but through sports, it makes it easier to talk about, oh man, you had this all-Black team during the middle of the Great Depression, during the middle of Jim Crow, get invited to an all-white town in an all-white state like Wisconsin. They go there, play that local team, beat that team, leave safely, and get invited back. How is that? You had to have collaboration. You had to have something else going on. And meanwhile, everybody's a winner. The merchants, the hotel, the bars, the saloons, or whatever, people coming from miles around to watch because it was entertainment, but it was also a social event for white people during that period. And so that was part of the business model also, right? Like, how do you do this? And then what can we learn from that?
Applied, what'd you say, applied?
Applied history.
Applied history. That's amazing. Recently I've been really trying to get a better grasp of the history, reading about Ali, reading about Jim Brown. I think it was Malcolm X who said, a man with no history is like a tree with no roots. You kind of just blowing in the wind. And when I read this history, as you mentioned, after George Floyd passed, it's not just to celebrate them, it's to see their ingenuity. Like, I get confidence from that. Looking at the trials and tribulations they went through and how they navigated that. And you also mentioned history repeats itself. So I feel like I got the tools to help navigate this earth because I read my history. And that is amazing, man. I wish more people would dive in. While I'm reading these books, like, this confidence fills my body. Drake just dropped the album.
Right.
but
You like it?
I didn't give it this one a listen.
Okay.
The previous one, he had a song where he said, "I got a sneaker deal and I ain't break a sweat." Yo, I thought that was one of the coolest lines. You know, that's one type of flex. You guys is running and jumping and tackling and shooting baskets and lifting weights to get your sneaker deal. I ain't have to go through all that. I just do my cool raps, and Jordan came and got me. And I said, man, Mr. Claude Johnson could say the same thing. He got the same boast.
That's right.
This year, the Black Fives organization signed a multi-year partnership with Puma. I looked on the video one day, I see Jay-Z, the God MC, in a Black Fives hoodie. Mr. Johnson, I need answers, man. How'd this happen?
I mean, Drake also said 7 a.m. in Germany. Can't believe that they heard of me, right? And I mean, that's fact now, right? So, I mean, it's a long story, long time coming, right? And, but, Puma, a great organization. At a certain point in time, we started talking to them, and at first it was through this part of the organization that's called Reform or #Reform. So people don't always realize, but Puma, they support prison reform through Meek Mill, LGBTQ reform, gender equality. People with disabilities, a lot of things that they do behind the scenes, and through their apparel collabos as well. And so, for example, Nipsey Hussle, that whole line that they have. And so the thing that I start to realize is, okay, but you're going back into basketball. You're trying to re-energize your position, because they used to be one of the players back in the day.
Well, Clyde Frazier,
right?
Ralph Sampson, yep.
Exactly, right? So, what about this Black basketball history? Because if you're trying to sign up for a partnership, it's already taken. So Nike already owns what's on the court. NCAA is already taken. There's very few other places where you can get authentic association with history and with culture and with heritage, except now you have the Black Fives Foundation. And so we started talking, and the logistics of how that exactly happened was intricate, and I could keep talking about it, but it all boiled down to they invited me up to Boston, because that's where Puma North America is, and we started having this conversation. But I want to say also that before that, through that reform department that's also run out of Boston, they invited me to the grand opening of the Puma flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Okay. So I brought Carnegie to that.
Your young son?
Yeah, my young son. He's the basketball player. I got two other ones that play football. And so I'm standing there in line. It's a red carpet event. Carnegie wasn't on the list, so somehow we had to talk our way, past the security to get him in. And so we're in. But before we got in, I noticed, here's Usain Bolt.
Wow.
Here's Sean Carter. Here's, an array of other people. And I noticed they all went upstairs. So as soon as we got in, I said, yo, Carnegie, follow me.
Let's go upstairs.
So we go upstairs. And get to the top floor, and I look back in the back, and there's Jay-Z with my man Emery Jones. They're just talking. There's like one individual talking to them. I say, follow me. So we just went right up to the spot. And, in a situation like that, you can't really say, like, hey, are you waiting in line? Or, is it okay if I just waited at a respectful distance till they were done. And I let them see that I was, not trying to rush them or anything. and I'm with a youth.
Yeah.
So when they're done, I said, "Hey, Jay, I want to introduce you to my son Carnegie."
Get up there, son. Come, go.
So they shake hands, and Jay goes, "Man, that's a great name and a great handshake. You're going to be a success in life." And it's like you're talking to Jay-Z. He looks exactly the same, and he's like exactly the human that you think he is from any video or any rap lyric or anything else. It's like he's standing right there. And then Emory. And then I go, and what I do is I run the Black Fives Foundation, and we own the intellectual property of these teams. And he goes, "Oh, intellectual property." So then Emory chimes in.
He was talking that boss talk, see? Intellectual property. Jay-Z perked up like, oh, okay.
No, because he knows, if anyone knows about that, he knows, right? Yeah. And so, because he has an empire of not just Rock Nation and music, but all these other collaborations where he's part ownership. So, going back to the Nets, which is another story, because that's a separate thing. But we have permanently installed murals that are life-size images of African American basketball players from the Black Fives era in Barclays Center. Right. So if next time you go there, you'll see them. You probably saw them already.
I've seen them.
Right. So so Emory says, "Oh yeah, I've been talking to your brother, because my brother is a designer who was at the time the global head of innovation for Puma." And so he was in Germany, and that was how we got some of the inroads to talk to and have a meeting there, which they said, "Okay, well, we really can't do anything. You got to talk to Puma North America." So it was a lot of different moving parts that had to be navigated. But when that happened with Emory and Jay, then it was like, okay, that validated that what we were trying to do. Because then after that, I could go, I went back to the folks in Boston. And I said, "Hey, well, I was just talking to Jay and Emory."
Yes, sir.
I mean, because we really were.
Right.
And after that encounter, which was crazy, because it was just like us four standing there talking, nobody waiting in line. We're just talking, like just regular. And that was like a moment for Carnegie also.
I'm sure.
Because I really wanted him to just understand, like, people are just regular people, but you have to have something to say first. And he went with it. He's not like starstruck kind of individual. Like he's met people before. So and then after that, Emory said, "Yeah, man, we're gonna be doing something big. Trust me." And of course, if you're an outsider and somebody's telling you that, you go like, "Okay, sure. Like, yeah, you're gonna get with me, okay." But I respected the situation. And I realized, okay, no, I could say that. Like the old me would have been like, yeah, whatever. But the new me was like, no, okay, let's go with this, right? Like let it, because what you learn in your wisdom is you realize, like sometimes you have to allow something to happen. You can't necessarily, you want to go after stuff, but sometimes you also have to allow it. If you've done everything you could to the best of your ability, and like you did everything you could possibly do, and then you leave it up to the universe, and you ask the universe and the creator to help you, but then you got to stop and let the universe act. And if it doesn't work out, then it just wasn't meant to be, right, for the greatest, highest good, right? But if you stay humble and grateful and open to the divine guidance of a situation for the greatest, highest good, then things somehow work out. So fast forward, we have this agreement with Puma, and it's a long-term partnership, and we have another drop coming up in October. It allows us to expand and do some other things within our brand. We just released a collection of T-shirts.
Right. You got some sneakers.
Got some sneakers.
The Black Five Pumas.
Yeah, multiple different kinds of styles. Apparel, we're going to have women's product as well, because a lot of these teams are women's teams as well from back in the day. And so, what's great about that is it gives us a certain amount of validation, certain amount of attention. I'm just still trying to stay humble with it because sometimes you'd be like, is this really happening? But it's allowed us to, the wherewithal to start, hiring a couple of people part-time. And we're going to do more of that. Next thing is, on the foundation side, we have to actually, we're a 501c3. So the next important step when you graduate to another level is you have to have a 5-year strategic plan. You have to have, a case for support, like why are we supporting this, and you have to have an annual report, and you have to have, a fundraising campaign and things like that. So that's what we're working on next, because you got to take it seriously. I mean, we've always taken it seriously, but sometimes you can't put it on the top shelf because, in my case, I'm trying to raise 3 scholar athletes as well, and so there's a lot of things always happening, and then I'm writing a book, and so sometimes you have to put something on the back burner. But now what I'm learning is, okay, you can do that, but now you can't do that anymore. Now you have to delegate, and so that's the next phase for this year and next year.
You talk about your 3 sons, 3 scholar athletes. First off, Mr. Johnson, do you know why I invited you to this podcast?
I think it was, tell me, because I don't want to speculate.
Because you're a real life superhero, all right? Let me tell you, going back to my days playing basketball at York College, one of my teammates, Steven Arzu, he is a big-time supporter of me and this show. He said, well, if you're talking about sports, if you're talking about education, if you're talking about business, if you're talking about community service, you need Claude Johnson on your podcast.
Oh, that's dope. Thank you, Steven.
He said I coached his young son, amazing young man, not just a young man, but just an amazing family. I said, all right, Steve, let me take a look. I looked at some of your work, Black Fives, Puma. I said, you know what? We need Claude Johnson on the podcast. And Claude, I recently received my doctorate.
I saw that. Congratulations.
Thank you. And you go through like a process where your coordinators ask you questions. And I told them, like, my community has an unhealthy relationship with sport. These young black kids, they want to be athletes, which is cool, but it's only a limited number of spots. We don't own the teams. We don't own the league. We don't own the juice companies. We don't own the sneakers.
Right.
And when that athletic career ends, whether it's at the pro level, college level, or even high school, a lot of people fall off the wagon. And you show that there's many ways to thrive in this space, sports space. Even though, like I said, the Drake line, got a sneaker deal and I ain't break a sweat. I saw a picture on your Instagram. You on a beach cruiser with some Puma, some Black Five Pumas on. Your son is in the advertisement. He got a Puma Black Fives jersey that ain't even come out yet. Like, that's amazing. You have your research and your work hanging on the walls in the Barclays Center. You never played in the NBA, did you?
No.
But your stuff is on the wall.
Right.
Mr. Johnson, this is amazing to still carve out a space to thrive. Successful people, successful careers in sports take many different forms, just like superheroes. You got Spider-Man, Batman. So I wanted to highlight that story. What impact do you want your work to have on your own kids? You got 2 young men playing football. With University of San Diego?
University of San Diego and
University of Michigan.
University of Michigan.
And then Carnegie, the young ball player, he's on his way to Division I scholarship. But you mentioned you want to raise scholar athletes. So what impact would you like your work to have on your children?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for those words. I mean, I'm just way too humble to even, but I'm learning to receive some of those kinds of kind words like what you just said. I feel like, I always, part of what drives me is to make a contribution, to make a meaningful contribution, to do something that caused change or disruption or just knowledge or just, awareness and enlightenment in some way, even if it's just about sports. And I'm doing that also because I had a really great relationship with my grandmother and her brothers and sisters who came from Louisiana, and my dad and his dad. I never met his dad, but I did a lot of research on how he was connected in that world. And so I feel like I owe it to our ancestors to tell this story and to link in the stories of all those ancestors, because that's really all of us. And then I want my sons to really realize and understand how this all connects together. And then I want them to also realize that sometimes everything is a journey. So you can sometimes be close to giving up on a journey because it's too hard, or not enough people understand it, or the right people that in your life that you wish understood it or embraced it or supported it don't. And so what do you do with that? Do you keep going? Do you trust your gut? Do you pray? What is it? And I want them to realize that sometimes you could be alone in your journey. But eventually, if you have a vision and you draw that vision out, it could literally be a piece of paper with stick figures on it that you draw that vision of what you see. Stick to that vision, because if you do all the things, it's like so many things that are done are invisible and nobody can see it until it comes out as a flower. And then people go like, oh, that's so great, you're so lucky. It's like, no, it's not lucky that you got a PhD, right? It didn't just happen.
Right.
It's years in the making, sometimes decades in the making. And so I want them to just appreciate that, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And you have a vision, and it's a journey, and you go on that journey one step at a time. You build a mountain one pebble at a time, whatever you're doing, whatever it is. But if you don't have a vision, then you're just like running around doing stuff. And like, that's fine, and you can get far. And then also stay grounded, because, without humility, you end up chasing things, and then you end up not really knowing where you are anyway. So if you stay grounded and you stay grateful, and then I think also I want them to understand the impact that sports can have. So if you have a platform and you can actually awaken people, and you can actually create something from nothing, which is what these pioneers did. They had nothing, but yet they created a flourishing world of business. And the same thing with the Black Fives brand, foundation. It started out as nothing. I mean, there were some academic papers and some research that had been done, and it was written about, obviously. But I hope that at some point, somebody will say, all right, this brother helped, bring all this history back to life, not just bring it back to life for some kind of commercial profit, but for meaningful, cultural, thriving, that is nourishment to everyone, black and white, worldwide. So I show them, right now Black Fives are being sold in South Africa, Denmark, Germany, Canada, all over, Foot Action, Foot Locker, and it's going to keep going. And we have an agreement. This is unannounced with, we're doing something with Lids, where we'll be in a bunch of Lids stores soon. We're doing some other things with, content, trying to put this on screen somehow.
There you go.
So I want them to just keep realizing, like, you don't just sit back one day and like drink beer and watch TV and put your feet up. Like, you got to keep going, because if you're active and you keep going, that's how you stay. That's how you stay fit. That's how you stay young. That's how you stay vibrant. And
I think I saw somewhere, maybe your social media, where you were described as a stay-at-home dad.
Yeah, I was a stay-at-home dad for a really long time. Yeah.
When I think of wealth, it's not attached to a number in the bank account. Like, it's a quality of life. You are doing work that is important to you with the Black Fives. You know, you got your Puma line. You mixing it up with Jay-Z. You're on the road lecturing to the Thunder, and you still have time to watch your boys play ball and do like that. That's amazing. Like I tell you, there's a picture on Instagram. You like on a beach cruise or somewhere in the South with some Puma Black Fives on. I looked and I said, wow, that's amazing. And I really wanted to highlight that story. There's many different ways to achieve success. You know, you're not limited to an athlete or a rapper. And I'm watching. I'm motivated. Thank you for joining me. How can we support you? How can we support the organization? Tell us about it. The book, the organization, everything.
I mean, I always go through that list. So we have our organization, which is blackfives.org, and then you can donate by going to give.blackfives.org. We have a shop. It's an online fan shop, and you can go to shop.blackfives.org. And then I have a new book that's out. You can go. This is the funny one. You can go to thatnewbook.com. Thatnewbook.com. Because you know what? Years ago, I just decided to get that domain. This was like maybe 10 years ago. Okay. And I knew one day I might be able to use it. And one day I might be able to, have a poster in here among all these amazing titles.
Bring it.
I want to give a shout out. Sorry for the audio. I want to give a shout out to Jesse Washington because the way this book came about is that I was writing profiles for the Hall of Fame, who has a special committee called the Early African American Basketball Pioneers Committee. And they put that in place because so many of these early pioneers were getting overlooked. And I was critical through my blog of the Hall of Fame till one day the president of the Hall of Fame called me and said, why do you keep,
making good trouble, huh?
We should talk. Yeah, I was definitely making good trouble. And so he said, well, what should we do? I said, well, you should have a committee the same way that all those Negro League players got enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so they, not just because of me, but I think other people were suggesting this. So sooner or later, they put this committee together. And I've been helping them with information and research and just advocating for early African-American basketball pioneers. So since they created that, they've now enshrined, I think it's 9 or 10, including one woman, in the Hall of Fame. And so they were asking me to write the profile for their enshrinement weekend program, which is a really nice publication. And but then for this one pioneer, Cumberland Posey, they somehow I would also get undefeated.com to I would write a few items for them as well. But Jesse Washington, they contacted him and said, you write it. And I'm like, man, why'd they give that gig to him? Right? And then not only that, but he calls me up and he goes, what can you tell me about Cumberland Posey? And in my old way, I would have been like, man, you do 20 years of research. Yeah. But something told me, because I've known Jesse from back when he was with Bounce Magazine and Bobito and all those guys, and some of the other things that he's done. And he put me on to Undefeated in the first place. So I would never turn my back on him like that, right? So I tell him everything I know. I put him onto all the links and everything on our website. And he writes this amazing piece on the Undefeated. And then at another point in time, I get a call from a literary agent. And he says, I called Jesse Washington and I said, that's a beautiful article. You should write a book about that. Have you ever considered it? And Jesse goes, I've considered it, but the person who needs to write that book is Claude Johnson, my man. Right? Yeah. So that's a magical moment. Yeah. That's why I'm giving a shout out, because it wouldn't have because you don't get a call from an agent saying, can I represent you for a book you haven't even written? Because I think you can write this book and I want to be your agent for it. Right. So he helps me. I write this proposal. He helps edit it, tell me what to put in it. I write it up. It's an 80-page proposal. He says, okay, are you done with it? Because you have to hurry up because I'm going to London. I'm coming back. We're going to give this to a variety of publishers, and we're going to give them a week. And then after that week, we're going to get offers and pick the best offer. So you know how I'm going to say, like, yeah, right, whatever. Because, okay, like I've heard this story before. Because what happens is you can send a proposal to 100 literary agents, and 100 of them, or 99, will throw it in the garbage.
Yep.
And then if they pick it and you do another proposal, you can send it to 100 publishers, and 99 of them will throw it in the garbage. Yep. But my man, he goes, no, we're going to go and we're going to do this. So I sent it to him. He comes back. He has me scheduled with HarperCollins, Amistad, Abrams, everybody. And I'm like, wow, this guy is legit. Like, he's really doing it. Mm-hmm. And so we go in and we get offers, and we get this offer from HarperCollins, and he's like, nah, we could do better. I'm like, no, what if they say no? What if the other one? He goes, no, trust me, we can do better. So he actually gets Abrams to outbid HarperCollins. There you go. And so we're with Abrams. And I'm glad we were with Abrams, because Abrams is putting massive marketing and all kinds of skill and talent into it. They're known they got their start as art book publishers. Okay, so I go back to Jesse and I go, hey, guess what? We got with Abrams. And Jesse goes, that's crazy, because my dad wrote an art book and it was published by Abrams. Wow. He was the first African-American art book ever published.
Full circle.
So this is why I'm saying, like, sometimes things happen and you just have to allow it to happen. You can't always grind after it. Like, you do grind, but also you sometimes have to just pause and to see where's divine guidance telling you what to do, right? Because if I had said, nah, man, like passive aggressive, I wish I could help you out. I could try to, like, this, none of this would have happened. And then, like, imagine we go to HarperCollins, that's fine, there's no disrespect. But then that wouldn't have been full circle with my man Jesse. So it's just so interesting. And I guess on a last note, just best wishes with your podcast.
Thank you, sir.
And career. Just keep it up, man, because you got people, like Skip Bayless coming on the show, and you're getting him to open up and talk about his life and his dog and everything. So. As Lil Wayne would say, interviews are like confessions. But if you're getting people to talk about their inner, passion and successes, and there's failures along the way.
Yes, sir.
There's lots of challenges along the way, but just got to keep at it. And anybody who's out there trying to run a business, start a business, create something, take out a piece of paper and draw a picture of it and just start there. Yeah.
Claude Johnson, thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
I'm William Holiday. That's WBH Radio. We're out.